Hi, I'm Matt Williams. Welcome to Glimpses. My guest today is an incredibly talented American novelist, prolific screenwriter, producer, and playwright. He is also a professor at Columbia School of the Arts and has taught or lectured at NYU, Yale, Harvard, and the University of New Mexico. Not too shabby. He is an American Book Award winner, and he won a Peabody Award for his film, The Tuskegee Airmen. Trey Ellis, welcome to Glimpses. I always do my homework. I found this as I was researching you. Mr. Ellis speaks fluent French and Italian and conversational Spanish and Portuguese. Now, I've been teaching with you at Columbia for a number of years, and we've been working on a project together for 2 years, and I had no idea you speak Portuguese. So you got to lay some Portuguese on me.
I mean, it doesn't come up very often, but it's like, if falo português, sim. Eu adoro Brazil.
I agree.
Yeah.
Whatever you just said.
I said I love Brazil. It's like one of my favorite places.
Okay. Do you just have a gift for languages, or do you got an ear for it? Are you an auditory learner or a visual learner?
I think I'm more a visual learner, but I think what I tell people is that, like, I'm just a snob. So then, and I just always wanted to be like seen as smart, and polyglots I just thought were smart people.
Right.
So when I got to, like, in high school, I took French and I took Latin, and then mainly Latin. And then when I got to Stanford, I started taking Italian and lived in Italy. So once I learned Italian at, like pretty fluently at 17, 18, then I thought, oh, I could learn French. I was going to travel across Africa for 4 months. I was hitchhiking across Africa.
Right.
So to learn French, I was watching on Antenne 2, is like their French television. And it's like, it was just on Italian TV. So I'd watch cartoons, He-Man, Masters of the Universe in French. So I learned French that way. It came back to me, so I could speak it. And then after that, I thought I could, the cheap way to be a polyglot is to use like a group of languages, like Romance languages.
Uh-huh.
So the Spanish and the Portuguese after that came up.
Well, I don't think you have to worry about seemingly being intelligent. You are one of the most intelligent guys I know. So I think
in terms of like the people that speak language, if I could speak Czech and Mandarin and something that, that's really different, that's a lot harder.
Now, I want to ask you, you're a writer, you're a prolific writer. When did you start writing? Were you little? Did you always know you wanted to write, or did that evolve in school? What happened?
Yeah, the other part of me is like I have the sense of story of myself, right? So I think I was in the 5th grade, and I had this idea that a novelist wouldn't have a boss and would live on a boat, in like a sailboat in Nantucket with a typewriter up on the deck, and then his supermodel wife would serve him martinis. I didn't know what a martini was, but I thought that would be a good life. So I thought, yeah, I want to be a writer. And really since from the 5th grade on, I've just known.
From the 5th grade on,
I was going to be a writer. Yeah,
you knew. And did you? And in the 5th and 6th grade, were you scribbling out stories, or?
Yeah, I did a play. I did that's in terms of acting, a little bit of acting. There's a TV show when I was a kid called Brian's Song. And
remember it very well.
And I was the only black kid in my class, of course. So my friend and I, we adapted unofficially. We had early VHS cameras and stuff. So we got the whole school together and made our production of Brian's Song with me, of course, as Gail Sayers, and this other guy, Alan Lowenstein, as Brian Piccolo. And I had to say, Brian Piccolo has cancer. And I was crying as a 5th grader. But we wrote it, and I wrote another screenplay. It's just like I was always writing stuff.
Always. Now, are there writers in your family?
My mother was she had studied psychology. Then she'd studied. After we were raised, grown, she went back to Yale Law School. Always, she wanted to be a writer. She wrote one play called Glimpses. And then she died before it came out, but she always wanted to be a writer. Yes.
And the title of her play was Glimpses.
Yes. It's crazy.
Had no idea. That's wild. So Do you? I know you love films, and you write films, and you produce films. You don't have to go through a whole list of films, but what are a few of your favorite films and why? What elements or what is it about a certain film that speaks to you?
Yeah, I always like the best film in front of me that really stops me. But I go back a lot to, Goodfellas is a movie I could just, whenever it's on, I just watch again to sort of see how it's made.
Right.
I like the idea of chaos and family in that film. And I like the idea of sort of the person observing their own life as it's happening. So there's a famous part in Goodfellas where he knows the day when he's going to be arrested, and it's like his special needs child has to go to the something, he's got to make the sauce for the something, and the helicopter's above him. It's a bump, 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 bump. That's that premonition. I think that was really, really powerful to me.
And I know Tender Mercies is one of your favorite, right?
Yeah.
You've referenced it for me in the past.
Yeah, and all the Horton Foote, right?
Right.
He's obviously one of the great playwrights of all time, but also a fantastic screenwriter. And he writes about people that aren't written about so much.
Right.
So I think that kind of the gentleness and the power and gentleness of his words it's something that really is stuck with me.
I had the good fortune many years ago when my production company was up and running, and we hired Horton Foote to adapt a book into a movie. And I remember he used a phrase, and he said, "I like the dailiness of this story." And he used the word dailiness. And I think that's speaking to what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
People that aren't shooting up or diving out of airplanes. It's just the quiet dailiness of life,
The tender mercies of life, right?
Yeah.
That sense that he really, with, like you, I teach at Columbia, and to teach people that you don't have to have like a gun fire or an infidelity or something to make it dramatic.
Yeah.
It just has to be that life or death.
But isn't the challenge on film, especially when you're writing film, is to find the illustrative behavior and action that's revealing the inner life. As a novelist, you can go in on an inner monologue and you can reveal the whole inner life on the page. But for film, it really takes a talent to find a specific piece of business or action that says everything about what's going on inside the character. Do you find
I totally agree. And also to have it come out without words. Just
Right.
today or yesterday, I was thinking about how to help my students, because a lot of times when they're writing a screenplay, they're coming at it from the page and the word,
Right.
and it's as if they're writing a play, and there's a lot of business. This happens, this happens, this happens, and I thought, well, just stop for a second, and I thought, for each point of this story you're trying to tell, what would be the tableau? What would be the image? What would be the wordless scene?
Yes.
That would tell this story? How could you tell your story without words? And think about that. Thinking in pictures. That's a great book by John Sayles about
Yes.
how to make movies. And I think about reminding our students to think in pictures.
I remember something from that book. I'm pulling it up from many years ago, that talk is cheap, action is expensive, right? Talk is cheap. Two people sitting and talking, that's not a very expensive movie.
Right.
Action is expensive, right?
Yeah, and with the sense of like trusting, like a silence and a slow movement and a look and letting people sit with something, and having that maturity to
Yes.
think, oh yeah, you just found out that your wife has cheated on you. Can you just hold on this person's face for a long time and have him be making a cappuccino, and maybe there's music, maybe there's not, but just like that could be the most devastating scene you've ever directed.
I've said this before. George Stevens, who directed a number of major movies, Giant being one of the most famous, he had a phrase that he used. He would say to his actors, "Think loudly, speak soft."
I love that.
And I really believe that's why the camera's there, is to record your thoughts. Every thought that Trey is having, that camera's recording it, right? And those emotions. So
Yeah, I think A Place in the Sun is probably one of my favorite movies
There you go.
of all time.
George, yeah, okay.
And I was in an acting class in LA with this guy, Milton Katselis, who's this legendary acting teacher. And this student, and all these actors were like, high-powered, like actors, professional actors, but they wanted to get back to the roots of real acting. They were high-powered TV actors trying to get back to theater acting. And a lot of them were overacting and crying about something. And he said, listen, as actors, you want to cry. As people, we don't want to cry. And I thought that's
There you go.
really smart. And I think the same way of like for writing, it's like as you might want to write that your characters are yelling. You might think exclamation points or all caps is somehow more dramatic, but not necessarily so.
And isn't the rule, if you're crying, then the audience doesn't have to cry? It's
Right.
better. You want the audience to cry, not you,
Yeah.
right? Well, let me ask you this. Trey Ellis is starting a story. Okay, blank page. Do you feel your way into the story, or do you think your way into the story? Do you start with a theme, a thought, or do you just an emotion that you have to write about? Or is it both? Is it happening simultaneously?
I think it happens simultaneously. It just depends. I mean, like sometimes, someone comes to me with a vague idea about something. And I
Right.
think, oh, let me think about that. Let me research it and look at it. And then if I can't stop thinking about it, then some images and things will come to me, and it's like, look, all you have to do is say that one word, and I'm off to the races. You've lit my imagination. If I'm lighting my own imagination, it comes from a lot of different things. Like my first book, Platitudes, I just had the image of a little boy who was sort of not sort of exactly a younger version of myself. I was 21, and I wrote about a 16-year-old laying in Riverside Park, around the corner where I grew up in New York City, on the grass, and you don't know if he's dead or alive. And then he opens his eyes, he's alive, and he skipped school. So I just thought that was interesting.
So you started with that image,
Yeah.
and then built it
And
out.
then I built a whole story. I said, well, what did his mother be like? His father like? Let me tell the story. And the story just sort of built from there in the craziest ways.
That's where I think non-writers don't understand that so much of what we do as writers is ask questions. You ask 1,001 questions every day. Like,
Right.
what do they have for breakfast? What's the mother like? What do they fear? What do they love? And you're just constantly asking yourself questions and answering them, right?
Absolutely. And Aaron Sorkin talks about like writing, really, that should be 90% thinking.
Yes.
So the idea of just thinking. So when I'm at my desk, and certainly I have to do that work, I'm writing and thinking, but it doesn't stop. So the idea of like, I call it putting yourself in harm's way of the muse, right? So I have a problem for that day, and when I'm taking a shower, going to bed, I keep a notebook by my bed. I'm walking around. If I have to pick up my 6-year-old to take her someplace, I'm just working that problem up in my head, sort of like a Rubik's Cube, all the time.
Right. And then it does come at weird times.
Yeah. And when it comes, it's so obvious.
Yeah, you have to, and I do the same thing. I got the yellow pad beside the bed, and damn it, most of the time it's in the shower, and I got remember this, so I can write it down.
Right. Because we've all had the time when, and also I'm a meditator. So
Yes.
I was meditating a couple of days ago, and this thing came to me, and it's like, yeah, I'll remember that. And so, you know what? I'm going to stop. I'm going to write this down. I put notes on my phone. Sometimes they're so cryptic. It's like pumpkin, exclamation point. And I'm like, what was that?
Latte.
But in general, I have to like, I've lost too many great ideas, I think, by thinking I'd remember them later.
No, I think it's imperative you write them down. And I'm going to talk about specifically writing screenplays, not plays or novels. And how the reason I'm asking this question is a few years ago, I was developing an idea with a screenwriter, and I come from the world of theater and character. And so I started pitching the characters. It was a father-son story, and I started talking about the character. He said, stop. And this is a very reputable screen. He said, stop. Yeah, I don't want to hear about characters. And he went like this, and he drew a chart. He goes, what happens? And we sat there for 2 days. He goes, and then what happens? And then what happens? And once he had the plot, then he went back and created the characters for that plot. And that was so antithetical to me. I thought, well, the characters will show you the story. Now, how tightly do you plot? How much do you allow the characters to get away from you and create the plot? How tightly do you structure that screenplay?
Yeah, I think plot is overrated. I think that, and as I tell my students, and I think for myself, like there's no matter how interesting you think the plot you're creating is, if you look, there's going to be a Serbian, silent film in the 1920s that's exactly the same story. Like somebody's told that story before.
Right.
The only special sauce you can bring is character, I think. So I work the opposite. I'm working from the inside out of the character. I think, how can I create a character who's irreplaceable, who's conflicted, who I just think really speaks to the moment of what I want to talk about? And then I figure out, what plot do I throw in front of them to get their plot to really get them to show themselves. What I talk about is, which I didn't realize until our colleague at school, Andy Beanon, told me that I think about every character, every person has a freak flag that they want to fly, that they don't want to fly, right? So the freak flag is all furled up. It's like this. It's all, and you just keep pushing at your character until suddenly they have to reveal their freak flag.
That's great. I love that. But isn't it interesting? Because I pulled good old Aristotle out, and he lists plot, character, thought, diction, music, spectacle. And I just had this conversation yesterday with my students. I said, we don't emotionally engage with a plot. We emotionally engage with characters. The plot exists just to put pressure on your characters so you crack them open so we know what's living inside them, or unfurl their freak flag, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there are the puzzle movies like, let's say, Inception. I think I don't think it's a great movie, but it's interesting.
Yep.
And there are puzzle mental movies like that where you're just trying to figure out what happened. And they're sufficiently interesting at the time that you kind of watch it but I do feel like I would take one Tender Mercies over 100 puzzle movies.
Yes, I agree 100%. I want to talk about spirit life a little bit, and not religion, but spirit. Is there a spiritual aspect when you're creating, or is it all intellect? And I tell my students, write from your heart, edit from your head, right? Do you incorporate spirituality in your creativity?
I was raised Episcopalian, and then I was telling my students this. Then but I was against organized religion.
Yeah.
And then, but I was very into Jesus. Like I just as a 15, 16-year-old, 13, 14, 15 to
Right.
16, I'd watch Godspell, Jesus Christ Superstar. I would pray. I just thought that image of love and all that stuff was so important to me. Then my mom, before she finished that play, she killed herself. She had MS. She was also in a marriage to a gay dad. My dad, who's closeted gay. A lot of bad things in her life. She killed herself when I was 16. That day, I stopped praying. Okay. I just thought that just the version of religion that I had wasn't serving me in this way. Then I came around for years of I read the Bhagavad Gita, I read the Quran, I read just sort of studying in a philosophical sense. And then in college, I came upon Buddhism and meditating. And also I have more of a scientific mind. I was in college really wanting to be if I weren't going to be a writer, I was going to be a theoretical physicist who also wrote books. But I liked the idea of just thinking of these big, cosmic things.
But you explored wisdom traditions from around the world.
All those things. And then, so since college and now that I'm 60, and then, I haven't been really sitting meditating 30 minutes a day for the last 40 years, but let's say the last 25 years or so, I certainly have every single day. And I will today, at some point, because I had to get up early and miss my time.
And you're teaching. And
so I try to bring in terms of settling my mind, I think of this in Buddhism, we'll talk about this monkey brain, that's just been stung by a scorpion and just all over the place. And I can certainly go there. And then I think, the idea of meditation and settling my brain in the sense of I think I picture a vial of water that's really muddy. And then if you just wait and you just let everything sort of settle so it's clear. So before I start working, before I have a big meeting, before I have to do anything that's important, I'd like to set and settle my mind.
That makes such sense. And knowing that you are a Buddhist, I looked, and the word Buddha comes from the root Bud, which is B-U-D-D-H, which means to wake up, right? And when I read that, I thought of you, and I thought of writers, because isn't that our job as writers? To wake people up, to awaken consciousness, to wake them up and have them look at the world slightly differently, in a slightly different way because of what you've written and the characters you've created?
Yeah, I think it's to awaken yourself, but I think in terms of as a writer, my self-expression is to, I think, just be honest with my expression and try to tell a story that only I could tell.
Do you have a personal mission statement as a writer? And you don't have to share it if you don't want to, but have you given yourself a personal mission statement?
I don't have a personal mission statement in that way. I'm not always just trying to teach or enlighten in some way.
Right.
like that's what awakening is, and this enlightenment of like people were benighted, they're, and then you lift the cover off them and they go, oh, I can see. I see it more like I'm trying to connect on an emotional level to the entire world. Like
it's so funny because one of the phrases I always use is stories connect us.
right.
Regardless of your culture, your background, wherever you live, your age, stories do connect us. It's that commonality that exists amongst all of us.
Right, and that's where I find when I'm honest with myself and don't pull punches with my stories and talk about some, usually I work in comedy and satire, but even then, like some difficult things, and even in my memoir about the tragedies of my life and
Right.
all that, how to get to the other side of that. Not explicitly trying to teach, but trying to just be honest and open. And then the feedback you get, I think, is the most gratifying is someone that's just, I felt that. And that's the awakening part, because I'm not a writer. I thought that I was the only one. And then I read your story and I realized that I made this link across space and time.
Being so honest in your writing, do you have a built-in bullshit detector? Or do you need an editor or a dramaturg to read it and tell you? Or do you feel when you're off track?
I feel when I'm pushing my punches, I think, but I think it's also good to get some feedback from people, because, things can live in the sort of platonic ideal of the story in your head. And, how many times I'm sure you write something, you just think, this is perfect, everyone's going to read it, and all they're going to do is buy me a drink and say that I'm a genius, And it's like, oh, it's not that way.
Yeah.
So just knowing that the disconnect between what's in my head and what's in the page and where I'm going, it takes some time.
But that takes talent and discipline and experience, because what you're seeing in your head, then to take this invisible world and then to put it down on that page on these little marks, so that when you read mine or I read yours, I'm seeing the same thing you saw 6 months ago sitting in your office. That takes great discipline, time, and I think experience. And the beautiful thing about being a writer at this ripe age is I'm still learning. I'm kind of getting the knack of it at 72, and that's kind of oh, okay, I'm kind of getting this writing thing down.
I do feel that in that way, I'm at my best now. At 60, I feel like I'm at my best. And, Hollywood certainly doesn't think so. But but that's really interesting. I do feel, that's when you think about people that have, crazy cognitive disabilities, what a terrible, terrible thing that would be, because I just feel like I'm just getting the hang of it now.
Yeah, and staying curious, right? And it's those questions. And how many times you're on the street or a subway and you see someone holding their child a little too tight, or you see someone in a pose and you go, what just and of course the story brain just kicks in, right? Yeah. And you start making up the story about that. Trey, you and I'm not going to talk about the project, but we've been collaborating on a project for a couple of years.
Right.
And I will say this, you were one of the best collaborators.
Oh.
And the reason being, you give and receive notes, and your demeanor is always calm and focused. You're super smart, obviously. But what happens with writers sometimes, I give them one note and they throw a hissy fit and go, burst into tears. Or the opposite, you give one note and they throw the whole script out and start writing over. And what I respect about you is you push back, I push back, and somewhere in there is this sacred tension. And you go, oh, there's the answer. It's right there. Now, did you learn that, or is that just being 60 years old and experienced?
Yeah, I think it's really being 60 years old, because in the early days, I'd get a note. I tell my students this all the time. My first thought is like, fuck you, you're an idiot, to the studio people or whatever. I just want to close up, or just, give them some window dressing, just try to play some kind of game with people of, give them change someone's name, but don't change the I hope they just forget. That
I know the drill.
And this idea, going back in Buddhism, this idea of beginner's mind, bringing that kind of humility to this story. There's a guy, I don't remember him, in the Writers Guild West, Dennis Palumbo. He was the he's a therapist, but he's a licensed therapist, but he also wrote the movie My Favorite Year, which is just a terrific movie.
Funny,
And
hilarious.
he is a therapist to writers, and he had a column which maybe there's a book of it. It's just writers coming to him with their problems, and a lot of the problems he talked about saying it doesn't matter if you are or think you are the smartest one in the room, right?
Right.
You're not the richest, you're not with the one with the power. Bringing that kind of humility is great. So understanding and seeing that I'm often wrong, I think is really, really helpful. And then the idea of getting sort of notes, the note under the note has been really helpful of saying, okay, what is the disconnect between my intention of you saying I'm a genius and you saying, no, I just don't understand something.
Right.
So figuring that out. And then what I love about working with you, when you work with actual professionals where the ego is taken out of it, when people say, there's a lot of talk about the best idea wins, but I think a lot of people, that's just like, they have a button that says that. It's like, no, it's my idea, the highway, really is what they're saying.
Yeah.
So the idea of like a professional, it's like, it's just a joy to work with somebody like you who knows what they're doing. I can imagine if you're like a really good chef, and there's a really good chef comes in and says, hey, how about some pepper? Oh, that's a great idea. But you know what I mean? It's like, it becomes a pleasure and it's a force multiplier.
Force multiplier, yes, because the focus is on improving the product, not parading your ego or having your way or whatever. And I really believe all creativity, either within yourself or with other people, lives in that, I call it sacred tension. I don't know what else to call it. It's that spark where, oh yeah, that feels right, right? And even in our conversations, we'll go back and forth and suddenly go, oh yeah, that's right. That's it.
Yeah, that's the bullshit detector that works really well. When you know that it's when you feel it and go, oh, right.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And that's what I try to tell my students and myself too. I think there's a hole in this story. I don't know what it is, but I know this part works and then this part works, but in the middle there, something's not working. And you can sit there and just like, what is it? And you can just get frustrated. Or you can say, look, I know the feel of this thing. And I think about the attributes of that empty space.
Right.
And if by thinking about those attributes, or it's something like this, or when people say this is the bad idea, or this is the on the nose thing, trying to work at it in all these different angles really is really helpful for me, because then I kind of say, look, I know that this thing's got to be sort of octagonally shaped to fit in this thing.
Right.
And then as I keep, then the magic happens of the meditation or taking the shower, going for a run, going to the gym, talking to whoever your friends about it, and it's like, okay, there it is. And then when it happens, it's always like it was right there on your desk the whole time.
And you just didn't see it. I know that feeling. And you go back and you go, I knew this, but I didn't know I knew it. Right.
And the feeling when it finally drops, you just like, I'll just be walking with my wife and go, oh, she's what? I just figured something out.
Yeah. I understand that feeling. So I'm a young writer. I'm 22 years old. I come to Mr. Trey Ellis and I go, I want to be a screenwriter. I want to write plays. What is the first piece of advice you would give me?
I think taking a class, I think it really is helpful to write yourself, is helpful. But I think really getting in front of a workshop of people, have that the idea of the workshop of a professional with non-professionals, reading and getting everybody's feedback and not being afraid of like letting it live in the air and reading it out loud and talking about it. I think that's the first step.
Yes.
And then it's the having the humility to rewrite. Because I think a lot of people instead, they just think I just got to hole off in be by myself, not talk to anybody, not talk. Oh, what are you working on? I can't talk about what I'm working on. And they just want to sort of drop like a dead bird, like a dog dropping a dead bird at a doorstep.
Right.
Just drop it off and say, here it is. Do you like it? It's like, no, this is it's a process. And really demystifying the process and thinking it's going to take a lot of work.
I want to jump on that, demystifying the process, because I think your notion as a 16-year-old on the yacht with your martini and the supermom, I think people have this notion of, I'm by the fireplace with my dog and my brandy and I'm knocking out these, and it's just hard, grueling work. And you're going to rewrite some of these scenes 20, 30 times, right? Yeah. And you're just going to keep doing it, but you have to enjoy the process. You must enjoy the process in order to be a real writer, correct?
Right, but the process it's a little masochistic too. So I always think about I also know when I wrote my first book. So what happened is I was in a creative writing class at Stanford, and I wrote a short story, just like this character Earl, and then even in the first couple of pages, I thought this could actually be a novel,
Ah,
and because I was always very I like short stories, but I wanted to be like this young, cool novelist guy. So then I went back to Italy, where I'd gone to school, or where done a school year abroad, and wrote the novel in the next 6 months. And the way I did that is I'd read all these Paris Review of Books interviews with novelists, and they all wrote for 4 hours a day every day. I read, Hemingway's, famous
Movable Feast.
Movable Feast, and like he'd have Armagnac and stuff, but he'd write a certain number of his words, and he'd finish his words, and he'd get drunk. But so I thought I'm just gonna write this thing, and do it, and then I just the idea of sort of coming to this, doing it all by myself, was just really hard at that point. So when I finished the book, sending it back to my professor in college, sending it to other people, having friends read it, just like keep working on it, that was really important to me. In that sense of, not having my ego in the way, and just thinking, how can I make this better? Help me make this better.
Yeah, but that's the thing. I've said that anything I've ever worked on in TV or film, theater, whatever, if it's inspired by love and guided by spirit, it usually works. When it's inspired by competition and driven by ego, it always fails. When you look, and so that you've used the word humility about 3 or 4 times. And I think that comes with maturity, because you have to be humble enough and quiet enough and simple enough to accept the criticism, process it, and keep working, keep doing those drafts, right? There's not a magic elixir. There's not some magic poof moment where, I've made the best screenplay ever.
It's true, but it's also what I was also thinking about. What happened to me in Italy is like looking at these writers that work for 4 hours. I would, of course, I used notebooks then, so I bought all these Italian like long sort of legal notebooks, and I had the clock for my 4 hours, and it's like, okay, it's 10. I was going to go 10 to 2. It's 10 o'clock. I turn it, and it's like 10:01. It's like it was just. So I invented. I have not. I won a patent, a writer's chair that has like a time release, seatbelt that you can't get up until you've written enough or written your 4 hours. So there is the kind of like the pain of the sitting with yourself for a long time, and the frustration that it's not coming. But my friend Ed Solomon, who's a terrific screenwriter, he wrote Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and a bunch of other pieces. He's talked to my class, and he said, I love this. He said, what you're writing now is not the last thing you're going to write.
Yes.
So I think that people are I think if it were the last thing you're going to write, you'd be paralyzed. You'd think, okay, if I'm going to finish this, if it's like sort of an opposite of like 1001 Nights, you're going to write a story. When you finish it, you're going to die. Then it's like every single, like, does a comma go here? You know what I mean? It's like, if you said, you know what, I'm writing this right now. I'm just writing something. And then I'll write something else, and I'll come back and rewrite this. It's just like I'm playing in this. I'm creating the raw material for some eventual story.
The image that I have is, and I've not used it with my students, is whether you cook or not, if you ever fried an egg, and when I'm frying an egg and I want it to be perfect because my wife likes it sunny side up, and I crack the egg and it inevitably breaks the yolk. And when I'm just kind of knocking around one hand, plop it in, it's fine. Yeah. And I thought, that's what you're describing in writing. If you want it to be perfect, the yolk's going to break. But if you kind of just either the vomit draft or the rough draft or as they say, the shitty draft, just get it out, right, the yolk stays intact. And then you can play around with the white of the egg, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I also say, when I say to my class all the time, and on this class that I teach at Sundance online, that I thought about, that David, living in Florence for so long, that David is obviously a huge part of living in Florence. Yeah. And they famously, they asked Michelangelo, how did you make this? It's incredible. And he said, well, I went to Carrara on the coast and got this giant piece of marble, and I took out everything that's not the David.
Yes.
And I thought, well, writers, we don't have the luxury of having any kind of raw material, right? If it's an idea in your head.
Right.
So I thought, what we do have is a rough draft. So if you think of a rough draft as raw material, so just like vomit draft, throw stuff together, put it together, whatever that thing is, then it's really not probably marble, but more like a big batch of clay that's vaguely shaped like a movie.
Do you know what's astounding? And it doesn't surprise me because we think a great deal alike. My father was a wood carver. And for me, writing is like wood carving. And it's the same thing. Instead of marble, he would take a piece of wood and, you start carving. And what my first draft is to go, what is it trying to be? What's the shape of it? You don't go in and start chiseling and putting in the irises of the eye. You have to find out what the shape is. And once I know what the shape is, and I go, that's what this wants to be, then I can go in and and each rewrite, each pass, you just keep taking another layer off until you have it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the idea that it's not going away, and Jordan Peele says that the rough draft is just building the sandbox, putting the sand in the sandbox where you're going to start playing. So I think demystifying that rough draft, that there are no bad ideas. I think about Tony Gilroy, the amazing writer. He wrote, to write Michael Clayton, I think is his best film. It's one of my favorite. That's a film I go to a lot. He couldn't crack it for years and years and years. And then he finally just sort of said, instead of just like rewriting from the beginning and trying to nibble at it, he said, let me just put it aside and try to rewrite a new script with this idea in mind. And then he came up with Michael Clayton. It's like, if he hadn't done all those extra drafts, right?
That foundational work. Yeah.
He wouldn't have gotten it.
And that goes back to the thinking.
Right.
Right. And I think that I really believe that that's the problem with young writers is they don't think deeply enough before they start writing. And then I used to do this all the time. Write yourself into a corner. I can almost tell you the page count on a screenplay where you're going to hit the wall.
Right.
It's about 3/4 of the way through as you're ascending action. And right before you get to the crisis moment, you're going to go, oh, wait, I don't really know what I'm writing about. Right.
Right. I've done everything. Everyone's talked to everybody else. Everything's happened that I wanted to happen. And it's like, it's not going to be a 75-page movie. There's like a poison pill in this thing.
Yeah, and you get it. The last thing I want to talk about is glimpses. The book I've written, and it's about finding little glimpses of God in your daily life. And by God, we're not talking about the guy on the cloud. Tenderness, moments of grace, goodness, mercy. And I ask every guest this, especially the ones that live in New York City. In and around New York City. Do you see glimpses in your daily life here in the city?
Yeah, I look for goodness I'm basically, I go back and forth between kind of being gloomy, as my wife might say sometimes.
That comes with being a writer, I think,
right.
too.
But also looking for glimpses of if not the divine, like the kindness that people have, of just, and the connection, human connection. I know maybe we talked about this too. Also coming from the Midwest into the big city, I say coming from the Midwest. I moved from Michigan when I was in the fourth grade, to Connecticut. But I still feel like I've got a kind of corn, Midwestern. Today, even on the subway, I was about to say hello to somebody. You're like, they're eating a cookie. This mom with a cookie, I was about to talk to her, and it's like, my kid's like, Dad, what's wrong with you? So, but we did look. I looked at her and looked at me, and she had this giant, beautiful cookie, and she was sharing it with her child. And we looked, and that sense of like the wonder of this mother and her child and this cookie. Just now, I thought was just this. New York is full of that.
Yes, yeah, but you got to be aware of it, and that's part of waking up and being aware and awake to life,
and seeing that the kindness of people, like, and understanding that, like, there's so many times that happens in New York and anywhere, or at least at the gym. I'm a total gym rat. And like people have this sort of the gym face to walk past you, and then just like a smile, and then you realize, oh, maybe it's my face. Maybe I'm the one that maybe they're responding to my lack of affect.
They're the mirror to you. Yeah.
Right. And then if we just give a little smile to somebody, it's just a sense of like, you see a totally different person. And they think that, New York City gets a bad rap for that. New York is a really warm place, I think. And also we're on top of each other. I think most New Yorkers are like more open and genuinely open in ways than a lot of people in a lot of other parts of the country.
I agree with that 100%. Now, I'm going to close this out. Because knowing you're a Buddhist, I found a Buddhist blessing. I hope it's a legitimate one. I was going to try to say this in the Tibetan language or in Vietnamese, and I gave up because I'm still trying to manage English. But I'll say it in plain English. May we all be well, happy and peaceful. May no harm come to us. May we all also have patience, courage, understanding, and determination to meet and overcome inevitable difficulties, problems, and failures in life. You don't have to be a Buddhist. I think that's kind of a blessing for everybody, right?
Yeah. Amen.
Amen.
Amen, brother.
Amen. Trey, thank you. I so appreciate you being on this show.
Oh, it's just a pleasure. I love talking with you, and it's just, it's fun. And,
Yeah,
and the whole project
you
is
always
great.
energize me. You always, there's people you talk to, and you kind of we go, oh, I need a drink or I need a nap. When I'm with you and we talk, I always feel energized. So that's a good thing.
That's same right back at you. This is great.
Well, that's it for this podcast. Thank you for joining us on Glimpses. As you go about your day, take the time to look around and catch a glimpse. My friends, thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Glimpses. Speaking of, Glimpses is now available for purchase at your online retailer of choice. And the best part? Every penny earned will be going to charities who support children in need. You can get your copy in the link below.